haven't got you up here at the moment. This is an all-female panel. We did have someone, male, who unfortunately has had to drop out for health reasons, but we know you're all there. We're all engaging with you. Good, excellent. You can all sit back down now. Good. So, thank you very much for everyone that has stayed here this afternoon. We are here to talk about advancing nature finance, and you have got a very good panel in front of you to talk about their experiences, what they're hearing on the ground, and how we can take this agenda forward. And before we sort of kick off and I hand over to this panel, I was just going to give a few of my reflections, having worked on this agenda for a while. So, actually, I should introduce myself. Hello, I'm Helen Edmondson, and I'm the Deputy Director for Green Finance, working for the UK's Department for Environment and Food and Rural Affairs. And before this panel, I was thinking, well, what have I sort of learnt about nature finance? And sort of 5 things I thought I would just kick us off with. So, about 10 years ago, I was working for the Department for Energy and Climate Change on climate finance. And there was a huge amount of energy, funnily enough, around the energy transition and about how we could finance that. Lots of conversations in the UNFCCC, sort of had the launch of the Green Climate Fund. It was hugely exciting. We've made huge progress. Still, obviously, lots to be done. And I feel now, working in the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, you've got the same energy around the natural environment, and it is really exciting. I think there's a lot of momentum out there. People are really interested in this agenda. You see it actually in the WEF. Businesses are starting to stand up, and I think that's the sort of real sort of inflection point that we're getting now. Businesses are starting to stand up and realise that this is an agenda that they need to grab with both hands. Karen, your work on this sort of with the risky business stuff, that's sort of really got people's attention. We've seen a whole number of reports starting to make this link between financial sector stability and environmental degradation. So businesses are truly at the table. But I also think consumers and just, you and your households, everyone is also talking about this. If you think of ICFIS, the report came out a couple of years ago. It was on the front page of the New York Times. This is now in people's households. People are talking about it. They're much more aware of the impacts of the degradation of the natural environment, pollution, much like the sort of climate changes in people's households. So there's just a huge amount of awareness across consumers, citizens, but critically also business. So we are starting to get this momentum about how we can change things. So second point, we are making progress. I do think there's progress. So in 2019, the UK launched its first ever green finance strategy. And in there, you've got all sorts of initiatives and actions we wanted to take on how do you green finance green, but also capture the opportunity here in the UK. And we have got this fantastic array of expertise in the finance sector, but also a really strong ENGO sector that really understands the natural environment and those activities that need to be undertaken so we can drive this forward. But also data. We have a really rich set of environmental data. So how do we bring these different component parts together so we can really start getting action? You had the Chancellor last year setting out in his Mansion House speech all of the work that we want to do on sustainable disclosures regime, lots of action being set out there. And critically, we've also had COP26, where nature is really up front and centre. I think the first real sort of strong package of announcements that got launched around COP26 was around deforestation and the action that we need to take on the natural environment. We've also seen the launch of TNFD, which I'm very excited to be hearing a bit more from Emily a bit later on. And that was one of the initiatives that we could start to see the sort of kernel of in the green finance strategy, and it's great to see that that initiative is being taken forward at pace. And then also from where I sit in DEFRA, we have our Landmark Environment Act. And this is a huge new piece of legislation that puts on a statutory footing all of our environmental targets. So just like we got on the climate change and the net zero side, we now have this Environment Act. So there's a really long, loud policy signal of the direction that this government wants to take. And within that, you also have, compliance markets for biodiversity net gain, which is starting to see how we can get critical revenue streams that can pay for the natural environment. And we also have our due diligence to sort of start driving out illegal deforestation that's brought into this country. We've also, and you heard from Emma earlier, we've had the launch of the UK Infrastructure Bank, lots of positive signals in there about the role that the natural environment can play in this sort of hybrid approach of greening infrastructure. And then also in our spending review last year, the government has made a commitment to really get behind private finance and private markets for the natural environment with a target to mobilise at least 500 million into the natural environment every year by 2027 and more than $1 billion by 2030. So there's lots of ambition out there and lots of progress that we've already made. The third thing I just wanted to flag, and I'm sure you're all been aware already, that there will be a Green Finance Strategy 2.0 in the autumn. Call for evidence was out, closed just a couple of weeks ago. Currently just going through all of your responses. Nature, natural environment has definitely come out in our targeted consultations, which is really exciting, as has the role that financial institutions can play to really support resilience and adaptation. So we're just working through those. Definitely want to show the progress as I've been setting out before since the previous Green Finance Strategy, but also what further action we can potentially take, building on all of your ideas and where government can add most value. We've also had really targeted engagement already in a whole bunch of different consultations. So we had a Nature Green paper, there was consultation on that earlier this year, and then actually working with the Green Finance Institute, the Broadway Initiative and Finance Earth, a really targeted consultation over the last year or so with the Financing Nature Recovery Report that came out just a few weeks ago, setting out a whole range of actions that not just government, but landowners, financial institutions, a whole range of partners need to take to really get this agenda moving. So there's lots of information and evidence out there, and we're just working through how best we can harness it. Fourth point, I will hand over to my panel soon, I promise. Fourth point is that there is lots of innovation and interest sort of popping up. There's loads of sort of exciting pilots happening, exciting examples of success. We have our Natural Environment and Investment Readiness Fund. There's now 85 projects, fantastic all over the country, people looking at different ways to be able to attract private finance. We're also developing an impact fund, which will be the first of its kind, where we can provide some risk capital as government to really accelerate the natural capital investment market. Really excited about that. And if anyone hasn't listened to Helen's podcasts on the GFI Hive, you should definitely do that. And she's got loads of examples of things that are happening on the ground, which is really exciting. And so then finally, if I'm going to hand it over to my panel, I think that where I sort of sit now is there's been huge progress. There's lots of energy. You've got all of these pilots popping up, loads of momentum. How do we get this to scale? What are those systems levers that we really need to tap into to turn these little islands of success into something much bigger? And I do think we've got the opportunity to do that, building on everyone's expertise around the table. This really is going to be a partnership. So, based on all of that, I think it's probably time for me to hand over to my panel. So, Emily, I'm going to kick off with you. If everyone could introduce themselves, and then just give a little bit of a flavour about, I set out lots of opportunities, what you see as the opportunity, but also, I guess, some of these challenges as well that we face on this agenda. Emily.
Thanks, Helen. Good afternoon, I think, everyone. Nice to meet you all. My name's Emily Mackenzie, and I work as the Technical Director in the Secretariat for the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. So I'm sure you're all familiar with TCFD. This is the TNFD. So my role is to support that task force. It includes 34 task force members. They're from financial institutions, corporates and service providers who are developing a framework by September next year for managing and acting on and disclosing nature-related risks and opportunities. So I might talk about that a little bit later in the panel, but I'll dive to your question. So from the position I'm in TNFD, I think one of the challenges we face, and in many ways it's bubbling up because of this interest and emerging understanding and pilot testing, all of that's bubbling up to looking at this space from a nature perspective and nature finance and wanting greater clarity and consistency and standardization about what all the moving parts are and how they fit together. So people talk about the alphabet soup of acronyms, that there are a lot of initiatives that are in this space meeting that demand and the need for greater alignment and connection among them. So that's something that in TNFD we've started from the very beginning to attempt to do. So working very closely with partners, the standards organisations like the International Sustainability Standards Board or the European standards that are now out for consultation with EFRAG, the voluntary groups in CDP, GRI and those, so that we make sure that everything is clear, what we're developing as a consolidated set, people know how it all fits together and where to go. So that's a challenge, but also an opportunity for us to go greater alignment and clarity over the next year.
Great, yes. There's definitely an alphabet soup out there and a need to bring this all together. And you've got some fantastic partners around the TNFD to do just that. So yeah, it is exciting. Karen, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Hi, so I'm Karen Ellis, I'm the Chief Economist at WWF UK. And so I oversee a work stream trying to promote a net zero, nature positive economy and financial sector. So just a small task then. So we were quite instrumental in mobilising a coalition to ask for the government to promote a net zero aligned financial centre in the UK, which did happen at COP26 last year, so we were super excited about that. And since then the government's also said it wants to see all publicly listed companies and financial institutions publish mandatory transition plans, how they're going to align with net zero and handle climate change risks, which we think is great to deal with the greenwashing risk that we had before, where companies were setting targets without necessarily having any kind of plan in place for how they were going to achieve that. And the government set up a transition plan task force, which is going to set the gold standard for these transition plans, and we are part of that task force. So that kicked off at the beginning of this year, and now work is underway to define the standards for these transition plans. And as part of that, we've been asked to lead a work stream around nature. How do you get nature into these transition plans? Which is a very exciting opportunity, and we think that nature needs to be part of these transition plans, partly because we'll never achieve net zero without tackling nature loss, as it's one of the biggest causes of emissions. Because nature can also provide quite a big proportion of our emissions reductions and mitigation potential, so there's lots of scope for opportunities there. But also because nature needs to be a goal in its own right, restoring nature, because as we've seen, we've heard from the Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity last year and a growing number of other studies, nature loss is posing very significant economic and social costs and risks to us as well. It's just as urgent as climate change. So we need nature restoration goals in their own right. And we would love to see them being net zero, nature positive transition plans. The challenge with that is that we don't have all of the bits of the architecture in place to do that yet for nature. For net zero, we've got a whole set of, we've got clear goals, we've got metrics, we've got pathways mapped out. We don't have that for nature. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to actually facilitate the incorporation of a clear nature positive goal. Nonetheless, there is lots of work that financial institutions can do to become more nature positive. So hopefully we can get into that a bit more later on in the conversation.
Fantastic, thank you, Karen. Yeah, I like to think, we work in a system, not a hierarchy. So the more that we can think about these issues in a connected way, the better, and the better outcomes that we will get. But yes, the architecture is definitely a challenge on the nature side, isn't it? Saskia, over to you.
So hi everyone, and thank you for inviting me. My name is Saskia de Vries. I'm with the Dutch Central Bank. At the Dutch Central Bank 2 years ago we published our first report. I think globally we were the first central bank to start looking into the financial risks posed by biodiversity loss. I suppose the positive news is that since we did that, a lot of our colleagues followed. So for example, in France, people used our methodology and did the same. In Malaysia, Brazil. So all over the world, central bankers and supervisors are starting to think about this topic, which I think is important progress. And currently, the NGFS, for those who are less familiar with it, the Network for Greening the Financial System, that was started in 2017 with about 8 central bankers globally who wanted to cooperate and make a difference in the area of green finance. And currently we have members from across the globe covering all jurisdictions. We just overhauled our work program, and where previously the work program focused mostly on climate-related risks. Again, I'm taking this risk perspective similar to my Bank of England colleague before me, which is very much, of course, in line with the way we approach these things. It was very much climate focused up until now, what we've been doing, and the NGFS has now tasked itself through a task force to use the coming years to embed nature-related considerations in all the work of the NGFS members, so these central banks and supervisors across the globe. And I'm co-chairing that work together with a colleague from Banque de France. So a lot of opportunity, I would say, in terms of the developments. Challenges also. In my first steering committee meeting, for example, at this NGFS, we were talking about the mandate and the proposed work program for our task force. And then some people were saying, but climate was easy and this is so hard. So I actually heard my colleague from Bank of England say the same just now. If this is making climate work look easy, then how hard can it be? So maybe that's the challenge analytically, but based on the progress up until now, I have good hope that we can do a lot.
I'm glad you finished on hope there. It was a slight worry.
I like challenges.
And hugely important work as well, as you said, that first report just starting to really unpack exactly what these potential financial related risks are. Again, it's sort of all part of this momentum is why people are sort of standing up and taking more attention of it. So great work. Helen.
Hi. I feel a bit weird in this chair. I'll just turn around and face you. I'm Director of Nature Programmes at the Green Finance Institute. We mainly focus on financing green. So how do we get capital mobilised into the real economy for some of the changes that we need to see? And I head up the nature programme work there. Although I will say we're also very proud to host the Secretariat for the TNFD as well and the UK National Consultation Group. So my day-to-day work is looking at how we mobilise finance into UK nature restoration. We commissioned FTech to do a report last year that showed there's a financing gap over the next decade of about 44 billion, best case scenario, 97 billion, least worst scenario, put it that way. So I think we're all on board now that private finance has to play a role. So at the Institute, we're sort of working on, well, what are some of the barriers to getting that money moving on the ground in terms of having project pipeline, which I think is one of the biggest challenges that we have at the moment. So getting projects to be investment ready, and obviously we're an advisor and assessor and work really closely with the National Environment Investment Readiness Fund to get projects in a position where they can create incomes and develop revenue streams, so they can then attract private investment to nature restoration or NBS projects, and 85 projects going, which is really incredible. And we also work with Scotland on something similar that hopefully will come out later. Who knows? Didn't hear it here. So it's still fingers crossed. But also we work with getting investors ready. So we hear that there's a wall of money out there, but it's not always, the projects aren't always in the right terms. We've got a really big gap in sort of concessionary capital at the moment, or even catalytic capital. It's wonderful to have the NERF fund for technical assistance and grant money, but we're often missing that de-risking piece, or even an impact tranche portion at the moment. The sort of philanthropic community in the UK at least is been quite behind in thinking about how it's going to be catalytic with its capital within the natural environment, less so in the social side. So we're working sort of how we can push through some of that learning from international examples on blended finance to maybe encourage similar use of concessionary capital in the UK. And it's early days for the UK Infrastructure Bank, but we're sort of looking at what kind of role could they play in that kind of capacity. So we look at everything from sustainable agriculture to natural flood management and water quality, but it is very, very early days on the opportunity side, on the investment side, it feels like.
Yeah, and this point about project pipeline, I mean, it comes up in all of our conversations, and I think for the natural environment, when we think about markets, it always comes back down to that revenue stream, doesn't it? Who's ultimately going to pay for this? Maybe sort of just coming back to you, I guess, with a bit, sort of provide us with a bit more information from things that you're seeing. It does feel like, as I said, there's a lot of momentum behind this agenda, and specifically over the last 1 to 2 years in particular. Just good just to get your reflections about what you have seen, the sort of the big advances over the last couple of years, and where you think more is needed.
Yeah, I guess I sort of divide up the risk and the investment side sort of separately, and it certainly feels on the risk side the last couple of years have been just kind of incredible, you know, obviously spearheaded by the work that you've done, and we hope to see something similar come out of the Bank of England. It'd be wonderful in terms of assessing financial flows. And I think the whole, as you mentioned, Helen, like nature related risk is now, everyone's kind of aware that it exists, thanks to BES and Dasgupta, and now obviously we have the TNFD having launched. So I feel sort of like the risk side is moving at pace, and I feel very confident about how that's going. But the only concern I have there is that I still don't feel like people have really understood the materiality of risk yet. Just from talk to a UK perspective, we talk to corporates in finance sector all the time, and they're like, oh yeah, TNFD, yeah, we're aware of it. It's like, you're aware of it, and everyone seems to be in listening mode and coming and hearing what's going on, but actually what are you doing to start implementing it through and working with pilots, and piloting sort of the beta framework as it comes out. So that's just my concern at the moment, like how do you actually get that going? And I think there's a role for data actually in that if we quantified the dependencies on UK industry, for example, on nature by sector, I think that would start to sort of push things forward a little bit, so you can actually start to see how does this impact my sector, and then with the TNFD you'll be able to drill down into your company. And then on the investment side, I think it's been really slow. I'm much less positive about momentum, that side. I mean, I've been tracking deal flows for about 4 years now, and in terms of money flowing into big landscape scale restoration deals, private finance, there aren't that many deals coming through, and you've seen the work we're trying to do on Hive. It's really hard to find case studies, and we're still not nailed blended finance. And then you take that side all the way through to public equity side. We're miles away from ever being able to have a fund full of publicly listed companies that's nature positive. As I'm sure Karen can contest to, a really long way away. And then on the debt side, sustainability linked notes, we're having some with biodiversity KPIs, biodiversity linked KPIs, but not much. So that side I think really needs a lot more focus.
Yeah, no, it's a challenge.
Yeah. And an opportunity.
And an opportunity. It is interesting, as you said, there's sort of this wall of capital out there that says we want to invest, but where are the projects, where can they move? And that feels like if we can unlock that, and I think for me, again, just this point, we've got all of these small scale pilots, but actually, how does that get to scale to get the money flowing? So yes, you can understand your risk, but if you still want to put your capital somewhere that's doing good, where does that go, and how we bring those two bits a bit closer together? More work needed. Emily, interesting, Helen's more optimistic approach around the risk-based approach, and that people are definitely aware of this, which I think has been a lot of the momentum behind the TNFD being set up and the great work that is in place and the launch of the second beta framework. Do you want to give us a bit of an update of the journey that you guys have been on, where you've got to, and what we've all got to look forward to?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I can give you a bit of a blow-by-blow. So, for those of you who aren't familiar, the TNFD formally launched last summer, and we're borrowing this idea from software development of an open innovation approach, which is very dynamic, is one way of putting it, and at pace, Helen emphasised. It basically means sort of every 3 months we're putting out what we call a beta release, a version of the framework with enhancements based on feedback and pilot testing and new additions. So we're building towards September 2023, which will be the full final publication of the framework. We did the first release back in March. So that set out the core components of this framework. So it's a nature-related risk and opportunity management and disclosure framework, building by design very much on the TCFD. So for those of you who are familiar with the TCFD, it has a set of disclosure recommendations which are by design designed around those same 4 pillars: risk management, strategy, governance, and metrics and targets. And then we went one step further because the task force felt, and we'd heard from the market, that because nature is new, unfamiliar, and as Karen said, we don't have the same architecture, we don't even really have the same understanding, that actually having an internal assessment process that people could follow to understand nature-related risks and opportunities would be helpful. So we've designed something called the LEAP approach, which takes you through the different components of doing that. And they're somewhat connected in that to meet the disclosure recommendations, you don't have to disclose every step of that process, but you have to have shown that you've gone through a similarly robust approach. So there's kind of a language for understanding nature, the disclosure recommendations, and the LEAP approach, which we put out this first version of in March. That was a big milestone for the task force. And then just last week on Tuesday, we did the second release. And we got really great feedback on the first release, but there was the one article from the Wall Street Journal was like, nice framework, where are the metrics?
It's always something.
Yeah, it was beavered away. Task Force beavered away for the next 3 months to think about the overall sort of structure for measurement and target setting. which we set out last Tuesday. And then we've gone deep on impacts and dependencies on nature, so draft guidance for impacts and dependencies. So that was kind of the centrepiece of the release last week, as well as formally launching our programme of pilot testing. So if any of you are interested in pilot testing the framework, we're again learning by doing between now and September next year. So everything we put out, hoping financial institutions and corporates will try to put it into practice, because we really want to create something that has rapid scaled uptake, so it needs to be practical to implement. So that's what we've got to so far, rapid progress and a lot that can already be implemented. But as soon as you get through one release, the clock is ticking to the next. So in early November will be the third release by the task force, and there, I guess the new big horizon for us, and we've already been speaking to Saskia and her colleagues about this, is around scenarios. So how do we think about nature-related scenarios, their connection with climate? We'll continue to progress in thinking on measurement to look at risk and opportunity metrics, also looking at target setting, working closely with the science-based targets for nature, which some of you may be familiar with, as well of course closely watching the progress with the CBD on the global targets for biodiversity. So that's where we're heading next. It's all sort of building towards, we hope, having kind of pretty much all the components of the framework finished by February next year, getting full set of pilot testing and feedback by June of next year, for the framework in September. So that's kind of our timeline, and it is very open, very collaborative, doing it in a very participatory way. So invite all of you who are interested to input. The way we've put the materials out is also highly interactive. So we do put things out as PDFs, but we also have an online framework website, so you can give us real-time feedback anytime you like on key questions that we're setting out, or the materials just writ large. That's my update.
Great. I hope you had at least a day off after the launch and you weren't going straight into the next phase.
Had a weekend off.
Just thinking about one of Helen's reflections actually on the risk side, about people are definitely aware, but are they really sort of getting that there's a material impact here? Do you think that will come a bit further down the line when they start actually doing some of the application of the framework? Or, I mean, just it's interesting why people sort of sign up to it in the first place, because obviously if you properly get behind all of the data and the impacts, that potentially suggests quite a big shift in how you're operating.
Yeah. Well, we're experiencing tremendous interest. So task force members themselves, obviously, is a big commitment. Includes, for example, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, some of the largest companies and financial institutions. So they are committing time to develop this framework because they're already experiencing these as material risks. We also have established something called the TNFD Forum, which is a grouping of organisations who are supportive of the mission of the task force and interested to learn from them and contribute. And that is growing rapidly. We now have 500 organisations here, members of the forum, and it's growing all the time. And that includes interest from regulators, central banks, policymakers in the UK and globally. So I get a sense of a growing, and I'd be interested in Saskia's thoughts on this too. For the NGFS's recent report made clear that it's within the mandate of central banks that these are material risks for central banks from a financial stability perspective. I get the same sense from a financial institution perspective that increasing recognition of this as material risk. So I do recognise what Helen's saying of the need for further maturity in that understanding, but my interpretation of the last year or two, and having in my previous role been with the Dasgupta Review, is that this recognition of science is telling us we're reaching these points at which they become material already, and so the increasing momentum around action is the next step.
Yeah, science meets economics.
Exactly. Yeah, it meets finance.
Yeah, it meets finance, exactly. Well, hugely exciting stuff, and I think in the recent CBD meetings out in Nairobi, I think Business for Nature were really vocal in the margins of just saying, we need more focus on these kinds of reporting and disclosures and, heightened awareness of all of these different kinds of tools. So there's, it's the businesses and the financial institutions that are calling for this. Not all of them, but a significant sway. So, Saskia, I might actually go straight to you, actually, because Emily sort of pointed to you a few times in terms of some of the work and leadership on the sort of linkages between financial institutions, financial sector stability, central banks. It'd be good just to get your thoughts, building on what you were saying before about what the next steps are and what's coming out.
Sure, yeah. So also to link a bit back to what you said, Emily, maybe to start there, the NGFS issued a statement, I think it was March this year, after the so-called Inspire NGFS research report was finished. I'll say a bit more about it. But in that statement, that was the first time that the NGFS, on behalf of all its members, really recognized that biodiversity loss can cause severe macroeconomic, have severe macroeconomic repercussions, and that the failure to account for that, to mitigate that, to not adjust your risk management, to that can pose significant financial risks to individual financial institutions, but also financial stability, which is why it is square within the mandate of central bankers and supervisors to consider these risks. So I think that's a bold statement. I think it was the first time. And we're going from there to say a little bit about the work that has been done and is intended. So, for example, what we did in our Dutch case, we did the first exploration of, okay, so how does this actually translate to financial risks then? And we went about it similarly to what we sometimes do for climate risk. So we examined both the physical risk side and transition risk. As regards physical risk, we looked at the dependencies of our financial institutions on ecosystem services. And in that case, we used the Encore database that is available. And some of the other central banks who did similar research after us used that too. It's not perfect data, but it works to get some estimates of some of the vulnerabilities. And that's on the physical risk side. And on the transition risk side, we also look to some of the data that is already out there in the environmental sphere to look at, for example, biodiversity footprints. Well, in our case, just to give you an idea of materiality, looking at that dependency on ecosystem services, we examined about 1,400 million in assets, and 500 of them were extremely highly exposed or dependent on ecosystem services. So it's not something you can overlook, so to say. And also on the transition risk side, well, we used a few ways to think about this, using a bit of triangulation, because there's no perfect way of measuring this yet. But one of the ways was, for example, to look at the biodiversity footprint of those institutions we supervise. And what was it? The impact on pristine nature, sort of the detrimental impact, covered the size of land about 1.7 times the Netherlands itself. So the institutions have quite a big footprint. And it's just a simple relative measure, but we thought it was significant enough to now try and do another research. That's something that I'm starting in our financial stability department, because the previous study was quite static. We just looked at gross exposures. We will now see if we can indeed move towards using scenario thinking, looking at some of the ways this could play out, and then actually determine what the systemic impact in different scenarios could be. To also think a bit about the tail risk. So that's an exploration we're doing at the Dutch Central Bank. Challenging, but ongoing. I have good hopes. And on the NGFS side, so we have our task force now. We just kicked off. So after that Inspire report, which was tremendously helpful and did like a stock take of all the thinking that is out there currently. The task force will utilize what is in that report and will broadly be doing three things. First of all, again, exploring, so stock taking, so seeing what metrics are out there, what are the best practices, what do we know, what don't we know, what are some of the gaps, and most importantly, perhaps at the end of that exercise, which we hope to be able to finish quite soon, because there's already quite a good report out there, to identify what exactly the gaps are that are impeding action now. So why can central banks and supervisors not act yet? And if we've pinpointed that, then we can hopefully think of ways of tackling that as well. The second thing we'll do is develop a common language. So we'll develop a conceptual framework so that at least we are in agreement amongst the members of the group how to think about these risk channels and the materialization, etc. to have that common language going forward. And finally, we'll engage with the other work streams within the NGFS. We have quite established work streams, for example, on supervision, scenario analysis, etc. But also the external stakeholders, so be it experts in academia or institutions. And then see if we can gather all the knowledge there is out there to fill those gaps, so that we can actually make sure our mandate is for 2 years. After that, the task force is supposed to dissolve itself again, because my end goal is then to have nature-related considerations embedded in all the work that the NGFS and its members do. So perhaps it's ambitious. On the other hand, I suppose a main message I would take from the work that we've done up until now, okay, it's suboptimal. We don't have all the data or the means of measuring these risks, but we can be resourceful and creative, and you can actually progress and get good estimates and progress the knowledge. And to me, it's not so different when we started working on climate about 8 years ago. It was just as obscure. We didn't know how to measure these things. So I think we will be able to do a lot by doing this.
Yeah, the expression, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Do what you can. I mean, 2 years, you should talk to Emily about working at pace with your task force. You can compare some notes.
We do.
Regularly by the sounds of things. Yeah. Just as a sort of a quick reflection, and I think it's great that the NGFS is helping drive this and the points about common language and how we can move forward. I mean, we obviously work with a global financial system, and money sort of moves around, obviously, doesn't it? So just a sort of a reflection, do you think there are things that individual national regulators can do by themselves, or do you think it needs to be a big global push where everyone moves at the same time, or where can we move forward in different places, do you think?
Oh, I think it's essential that national regulators do a lot of thinking as well, and I think that's also a driver, what we're able to do now with the broader NGFS task force. Because some of the case studies covered in that NGFS Inspire report, they're from about 8 or 9 different countries across the globe, so Malaysia, Brazil, France, and we need that knowledge, and also some of the local knowledge, I would say, because biodiversity is not the same across the globe. I mean, Brazil did a similar study. Well, there, I mean, it's vastly different than our situation, for example, in the Netherlands. So we need those case studies to develop the knowledge that we're looking for. So I would say they're complementary and both needed. And just to give you an idea, also very positive, I think, we had the call for participants in our NGFS task force. We now have 100 jurisdictions participating, which is a lot, but I think it's very positive in terms of bringing this forward. There's a lot of interest.
That is hugely positive, and back to this point about there being a lot of momentum and interest about how to take this forward. Karen, just sort of, I think, so there's a bit of risk and there's a bit of opportunity, isn't there? So obviously WWF, you've got your biodiversity risk tool. It'd be good just to get your thoughts about how that can help start filling some of the gaps that people are talking about. But then back to the points you were raising at the very beginning, just about this point about a sort of nature positive goal, what are those metrics, how can we get collective views about how to drive this forward. You know, I sort of mentioned at the beginning having this long, loud, clear policy signal, the direction of travel, and you sort of get the sense from business a bit like the, 2 degrees, it sort of really focuses mind, doesn't it? And what we can do on the nature side.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so yeah, WWF has been developing a biodiversity risk filter tool, which is replicating what they've done on the water risk filter tool, in case anyone's come across that, which is an online tool, freely available. It's been around for about 10 years now. It's been developing over that period, enabling companies and financial institutions to map, using spatially explicit data, where their risks are likely to be on the waterfront and now on the biodiversity front. Both in terms of which sectors they're operating in, how their operations work, where they're located. So it enables different lenses to actually analyse where the biggest risks and threats and opportunities are, to help companies identify and focus in on the sort of particular locations and issues they need to deal with. And the water risk filter has been hugely popular and taken up by many different companies, being really valuable. Now it's been developed further and enables scenario analysis, so you can look at how your risk might play out going forward as well. The biodiversity risk filter is in development. It's not released yet. Hopefully next year it will come out, but it is being pilot tested by a number of companies at the moment. It's the kind of tool that I really hope will help companies to address the TNFD sorts of guidance frameworks that are being developed and give them something, a practical thing that they can use to actually start to navigate this very challenging issue. So I think it's great that there's so much interest in it, both that and the water risk one. And companies, a lot of companies are making a lot of effort to try and understand these issues and start to address them. But I suppose where we come onto the sort of macroeconomic story is that by itself this won't be enough, because it's really challenging stuff and the incentives are not yet strong enough to actually lead to companies doing enough on this front, because it's both challenging and they're just not incentivized and they're not rewarded financially enough to make the effort to do as much as is needed. So I think what we need is that sort of what is good enough and regulation around that, just as we have now got for net zero, or that is beginning to come into place in the UK and other countries increasingly. Even that's taken a while. You know, I think we did the FT100 scorecard, which showed how many companies had actually got a transition plan in place, as I said earlier, and there weren't nearly enough, less than 20% actually had a transition plan. That was last year. So you need this to become mandated and to be regulated and then to be scrutinised and incentivised through regulatory frameworks. And that's what we haven't really got any progress on yet, I suppose, on the nature side. Hopefully TNFD will help to facilitate that process and get it into disclosure requirements over time. But we still need that goal and clear sort of possibly 1, 2 or 3, I don't know if that's realistic, Emily would know more about this than me, metrics to focus the attention of the private sector around that. What do they need to deliver in order to become aligned with a nature positive global goal? That is not an easy question to answer at the moment. Net zero is much easier. You know, we've got an agreed goal in the Paris Accord and we've got net zero emissions as a very widely agreed metric now. We need that for nature as well. And so we're really hoping that we get that at the Conventional Biological Diversity, CBD COP this year, a global goal for nature. WWF has been advocating for this along with a whole coalition of others, which will basically agree a biodiversity or nature restoration goal so that by 2030 we have the same amount of nature as we had in 2020. At the moment we're not on track, we're going down. We need to turn that around and start going up. And then ideally also a small number of metrics that can ladder up to that, delivering that nature positive goal, and that can be operationalizable, is that the word, by companies. Can actually be translated into actions they can take and impacts they can see from their own business operations. So there's a bit of translation needed between the sort of global science metrics and planetary boundaries metrics down into what companies can actually do. So there's a lot of work to be done in that space, and we are sort of really keen that that work gets done as quickly as possible so that we can start to build those sort of standards into transition plans and the whole regulatory framework that's emerging around this going forward, so that private sector is mobilised to deliver on this overall nature positive requirement that needs to be defined by science, really, rather than just sort of guessing and working out for themselves what they need to be doing, which is the current sort of state of play. So that's really, I think, where we see, you know, a two-track approach: capitalise on what companies are doing now and try and drive that and support that as much as possible, but also create that overarching framework that defines what needs to be done and what best practice and good enough looks like, basically.
I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? You sort of, you can have the sort of nature goals at the top, and then, you know, Helen, you were talking before about, well, how do we make this real, and being able to focus in on the sectors so that they're really clear about, well, what action do they need to take, and which charters that I've seen that shows, you know, all of the industries that are heavily reliant on ecosystems and their services. And it's not just the traditional, of course, agriculture is really up there front and centre, but, you know, pharmaceuticals, battery production, you know, it's all of our industries are interlinked. I think when you interviewed Simon Zadok, Helen, you know, he was very much, it's not just half of our GDP that's reliant, but everything is completely reliant on our natural environment. And the more that we start thinking through that lens, the more we can actually get people to sort of stand up and start thinking much more differently about their wider supply chains and all of the different actions that they're taking. And I think the other thing that comes out for me in the conversations here and wider that I'm having is just how local a lot of this stuff is. So, you know, carbon sequestration happens all over the place, but it becomes so local when we think about the natural environment. And then you quickly get into, well, do we have the right data? And, you know, on the one hand, we hear about all of the advances that we have on data, you know, spatial technologies. And then on the other, I constantly hear, well, but data is a stumbling block if we really want to move forward on this. And I guess just interested in the panel's views on this sort of data question and where they are seeing positive movements, where you think more might be needed to be able to feed into all of these different frameworks and processes so we get action. Go on, Emily.
I'm happy to go first, just building, especially on what Karen was describing, because we've been seeing the task forces work in a very similar, in fact, we've been using the same language of architecture. So from global scale to national to local, needing both metrics and targets. Ultimately, that's the structure you need in place. They all need to align. So you've got the global setting of targets by the CBT and measurements that are aligned with that. You've got national level policy and then the local level where it really hits the ground. And so we're developing a market-led framework in the absence of having all those pieces in place, which makes it more complicated, but there's tremendous momentum to do so and the right conversations with the right groups to try to align it all. But to come to your question on data, because obviously data isn't happening in a vacuum. You want data in the context of that measurement and target setting framework, so you're using data to measure the right things to achieve the right targets. So one of the things the task force did back in March with the first beta release was to put out its first external discussion paper on the subject of data. They did a rapid landscape assessment of what were there as sources and platforms for data. And two, I think they're our most popular product so far, is these hypothetical case studies where walking through the framework step by step, took 2 case studies, going through the framework. Where do you find the data? Can you get it? Where would you go? And you give examples. We're not sort of saying these are the tools, but you can use Encore for this step, or you can use Source for this step. How do you actually put it into practice? So that was a really useful exercise, and maybe I'll just highlight two challenges that came from that align with what you were saying, Helen. So first is that there's no shortage of data, although the data is inconsistent and has some biases. It's more about the need for a standardized approach and clarity of understanding about how to do that in a consistent way to inform decision making. So plenty of data, but a bit of lack of understanding, a bit of a scramble to understand, well, what do I go? It seems quite a confusing landscape. So we hope in TNFD to help with that by providing a more standardized approach. The second is around what you mentioned about the need for that much of what happens with nature is local and place-based, and that's something we really emphasize in the framework. Kind of our mantra is location, 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 because what happens in one place, your impacts and dependencies in one location will be very different from another, so you need to really have place-based data. So that creates new challenges or opportunities for innovation for spatial data, whether that be where there's business assets, which I know a number of the groups in this community have been really pioneering sort of asset level data across supply chains, but also then the ecosystem measurement data in that location and understanding how the two interact. So it's actually quite a different frontier from typical ESG measurement. And it requires spatial data. It's not just self-disclosure and questionnaires. But there's tremendous excitement around things like environmental DNA, remote sensing, these new technologies that could rapidly increase the ability to measure what we need to be measured in a robust way against the framework. So one of the things actually we're going to be launching this week is a data catalyst initiative to try to catalyse, to bring data providers together to show the way the TNFD standard is developing, informed by how the architecture is shaping up from global to national to local, and to give a sight of that standard to kind of try to further, it's already evolving rapidly, but even further stimulate and catalyse further innovation, particularly around spatial data and analysis, so that by the time we get to September and launch the framework, the data and analytics landscape is in better shape to apply it and enable uptake than it would have been otherwise. So
sounds great.
it's a really important priority for us, because if you get to a framework and don't have the data and even the understanding of the data and how to analyse it, you have a great framework but struggles to apply it.
Yeah, no, completely. And I think you see it in both worlds. You see it in the ESG world and their sort of need and desire for better data. And obviously Emma Howard-Boyd earlier was talking about concerns around greenwash. And, you know, if you've got better data, then that helps address some of the issues there. But then also on the opportunity side, if you have better data, that can actually start capturing, well, this is the ecosystem service that I then want to sell. That really helps enable the revenue stream that Helen, you were talking about earlier. That's quite challenging if we're trying to develop these basically payment for ecosystem services, but at a national level to really get that opportunity moving. So there's sort of these different communities of different needs for data. Anybody else got any thoughts on the big old data question?
I think it's just the same on the investment side, as you say. Like we were talking to some projects in Finland this week about peatland. Did they have a peatland code? Because they have a peatland carbon code here, and they said we have 50 types of peatland. We do not need it. I mean, and here I know we've looked at bogs, we're going to look at fens, and it's how do you, the data's there, but it's kind of what data do we need that is of a standard that investors are happy with and that projects can actually afford to present, and the environmental sector is happy with too. So I'm just all for the role of standards, or at least guiding principles, while standards are being developed, are just so important in this really nascent space, whether it's on the risk side or the opportunity side.
Yeah, and that Financing Nature Recovery report that I mentioned at the beginning, that's one of their big recommendations that comes out, the need for standardisation of standards, but also potentially data more generally. So you're not sort of saying private sector folk, people who are collecting data, stop, but you're saying, you know, this is what good looks like, you know, to give integrity to these markets, which is going to be really key. So just thinking about regulators, so, you know, if you want to be able to regulate a market, surely you need to have some information and data, otherwise it becomes a little bit subjective. Just sort of wondering what your thoughts are. And we talked a bit about, well, we can't let the perfect get in the way of the good, but presumably there is a stage at some point where if it's just too hazy or we don't have the data, it becomes quite difficult for a regulator to do their job. I don't know if that conversation has been earthed in your conversations.
Yeah, no, so what to add from my perspective, we are extremely happy that these types of initiatives, such as your task force, are around, because I think similar to what happened for climate, that's the beginning, and that way we will go to more harmonized data and more disclosures at some point, hopefully, and transparency, which indeed will allow us to do our job better as well. Perhaps 2 points. What we noticed in our first explorations of the risk side, transition risk is particularly hard to measure because indeed there is not one metric as CO2 would be for climate. So if at some point we would converge on at least a set of metrics, it can be a multiplicity of measures, but at least that there are more common metrics used globally, I think that would help tremendously. And second, for biodiversity, I suppose, or nature-related risk, the same holds true as for climate. I mean, there is a fundamental uncertainty about the paths that will be followed, about impacts. There is non-linearity in a lot of the relationships. There are tipping points. And all this together makes that, for example, stress testing is a good tool for us to use in order to get at least a sense of some of the risks out there and the vulnerabilities to the assumptions you make. In that sense, getting the data and the scenarios in order that we would be able to use as central bankers and regulators, I think that might very much spur progress on our side as well.
Yeah. I mean, Carol, you're obviously working with the Transition Plan Task Force that you touched on before and looking at the role of nature within those sectors. Do you think data is going to be something that you will get into in terms of, well, if we want to provide a transition, how do we map that out? Which data sources do we use? Or how do we start showing the sort of transparency and the credibility of those transition plans?
Yeah, I think we'll definitely be getting into that, and I hope that the TNFD and the other bits of the jigsaw will come together in time to really inform that, because I think we will need that kind of guidance. Just on the data question, I was at a round table a couple of weeks ago where the first half of the round table, lots of people saying, oh, we haven't got the data we need, and the second half of the round table got taken over by a load of people saying, we've got too much data, there's a plethora of different data and metrics, we don't know what to use or what the most decision relevant frameworks to use are. So I thought that was really interesting, and so I think I just agree with what others have been saying about the need for standardisation and clarity about what the data is that we actually need to use and report against. So, so in transition plans, yeah, absolutely, and I think that is part of the challenge. I think what we're going to have to do on the transition plan piece, because there's quite short deadlines, we've also got that time pressure on us as well in terms of the transition plan thinking, is sort of entry level what companies we would expect to do in their transition plan, but because they're required to produce these by the end of 2023, it's not very far off. So what are the sort of entry points that we need? What do the few key things that companies need to be publishing in their transition plans to make them, to capture the biggest nature-related risks and opportunities, I suppose, but then have a placeholder that says, and actually in due course we're going to need these to become nature-positive transition plans that have, aligned with the frameworks that are being developed at the moment. I think that's probably the direction of travel will go. It's all very early days, I have to say, so watch this space, but there's some obvious things that companies can be doing, around deforestation, around agricultural emissions, there's some very clear and obvious links, and the biggest impact things that we can focus on and that companies can assess their exposure to, or a potential to use as part of their transition plan towards net zero, let alone nature positive goals. So I think that's probably where the initial focus will be, and but then we'll build on that over time, I hope.
Yeah, there's something quite tactical, isn't there, about sort of focusing, as you say, on the areas where you can have the biggest impact. And actually there are sort of sectors ready to go and are already aware, and sort of showing what good can look like, rather than, what's the expression, boiling the ocean? Not that we want to do that, just so we're all really clear. And I think it's interesting, just your point on the data, and there's sort of these two what feel like potentially polar arguments, but actually it's all sort of in the same of, it's just very messy out there, and there's lots of things popping up, and actually that role of standardisation, I mean, there's a huge sort of energy as well, conversations that I've been having around sort of environmental tech, and the role of technology in sort of doing, MRV, the monitoring, reporting and verification of some of these activities as well. So a lot of energy, but I guess how do we harness that in a way where we're sort of all heading in the right direction? You're thinking, Emily, of the points you were raising at the beginning of the alphabet soup and all of the different initiatives, but actually let's come all in the same direction, otherwise it becomes just really difficult for businesses to know, well, which framework should I be reporting against on which time scale, and we're not sort of moving forward. So one final question before opening up to our esteemed audience for questions. Sort of, I mentioned at the beginning the green finance strategy. So obviously 2019 we had our first, and we just had our call for evidence, and maybe many of you actually worked with your organisations to write back to us, so you can give us some of the highlights now. But what would be your one thing that you would pull out? I'll keep talking for a bit so you can collect your thoughts, that you would sort of want to leave with government about. And I think this is a really important point. What really is the role for government in supporting both the financing green but also the greening finance agenda? I sort of said at the beginning, this is a partnership and we all do need to come together, and government does really need to be clear about, where we can effectively come in and really support this, working with others. We definitely don't want to crowd out. Role of standardisation potentially is one of those key areas. But what do you want to leave with, me as the Deputy Director of the Green Finance on the call for evidence? I'll read them all later, but who wants to go first?
I can go if you want to go first. So you already know all those things I've been talking about, and we've all been talking about, I think, today. So the additional thing I would say is that we also called for in our response was a nature-positive economy roadmap, because I think the other big lever and driver is creating incentives to invest in nature, which aren't currently there, because it's a massive market failure, it's not monetized, it's hard to make a return from investing in nature a lot of the time. So actually thinking about how you actually turn nature into an investable proposition and put in place the key measures to do that. I know there's some of that already underway, but not enough is really being done on that front. And so in the way that we've got a net zero strategy in the UK, maybe we need a nature positive economic strategy as well that would actually operationalise the Environment Act, which has just gone through. How are we actually going to achieve that? What are the financing mechanisms going to be, and what are the policies going to be that will unlock that financing and scale it up massively? And also, the Nature Positive Economy Roadmap we've talked about has an international dimension as well. It's looking at that financial architecture piece as well. What are the building blocks we need, and what are the ones that are missing currently for nature positive that we should work together as a global community to address, which includes things the IFIs should do, you know, IMF, World Bank and WTO even. You know, there's a whole bunch of things that we need done to create a nature positive economy. So just mapping that out, because I feel as though lots of commitments have been made to a nature positive economy without really having any clarity on how you actually operationalise that. So having that set out at a high level and getting buy-in from the key players in this globally, I think would be really, really valuable.
Fantastic. Both the domestic and the international side as well there, which is really nice. Who wants to go next?
I'll have a go. It's nice. It's like Christmas. I get to give you a wish list today. What would I love? I think one, I'd just really love the Bank of England to follow Dutch National Bank's example by quantifying the nature-related dependencies that we have so I'm getting this all wrong, but the UK financial flow exposure to. If you take those words and put them in different order, you hopefully made sense. Would love to see that, because one, I think it leads to, okay, it's tone from the top, we hear that it's coming, it will encourage TNFD to start getting picked up. And then if you can quantify it by sector, you can begin to then create sectoral pathways, because you then get buy-in from sectors, you start to engage with them, you work with the likes of WWF and RSPB and many other bodies to actually sit down and say, what's your sectoral pathway from do no significant harm to nature positive? So I'd love to see that kind of real push from the top. I mean, UK government funded several million into TNFD, so we know that there is buy-in here, but just that extra push in seeing the financial flow exposure, I just love. And then on the other side, it's and we've talked about this at length, but having a standard of standards almost, because we've got so many carbon codes being developed in this country, and it's good, and we want them from agroforestry and soil health and hedgerow carbon code. I mean, you name it, we can create a code for it. But there needs to be sort of collective standard that sits above them. Otherwise, it's going to be it's just going to be a bit of a bun fight of different codes happening. So those two, I think, are my wish list.
I'll let you off. I did say one, but I think both of those are really good. So.
Well, from my side, it seems strange to ask the UK government.
That's true, actually. I should have rephrased my
But no, what I would say, I mean, from a central bank perspective, we see the risks, and what will be required, I suppose, from the political side is credible transition paths. So if you see the risks as well, it's a bit what you are saying, then please take timely and hopefully predictable at some point policy action coordinated in an international manner, because that is the way to mitigate some of the risks we see where you don't manage this properly and there are shocks, and then you can actually have materializing risks to financial stability. So that would be my wish for Christmas.
As a Dutch, yes, fine. I get your point. Those are funny phrase questions to you. Emily?
So as Helen already made clear, we already got a big Christmas present from the UK government. So continued support for TNFD would be great. I guess the Green Finance Institute is now coordinating a UK consultation group. So I think we now have 6 national level consultation groups, including one here in the UK. So your support as a market-led group, but the UK government support to help that thrive, so we can learn from the feedback and pilot testing here in the UK, which is in many ways quite an advanced country, and thinking about this would be terrific. And then I guess, I'm not sure I'm going to articulate this very clearly, but I think the UK government has this sort of sight at international, national and local levels, and actually quite a sophisticated measurement and target setting system compared to most countries in the world. So through your engagement with the CBD, continuing to push for clarity and an ambitious global biodiversity framework, which isn't yet locked in, continuing to push on that front, continuing to look at the links then to the national targets through the Environment Act and the measurement methodologies that are being developed. There's so much here in the UK, whether it be biodiversity net gain or the ecosystem service management. There's just so much we could learn from in the UK, so that we could then sort of think. So we actually have ambitiously, we were pushed, and so we did set out not only guidance on measurement of impacts and dependency on nature, but some illustrative sets of metrics. So we can already start to stress test those, see if they work here as well as in other countries, and learn by doing. So the more you can help us to create a framework that is fit for purpose across the different scales globally, but informed by the work in the UK, the better.
Great, well I've got my wish list. It's a bit early for Christmas, but I'll definitely take it away. I mean, my sense is there's a lot on the why, there's a lot on the what, and it's sort of shifting to the how. And then really scaling up the sort of pilots, but also recognising there's going to just be a lot of iteration and learning by doing as we sort of work through. And Saskia, your point about an orderly transition is really key as well. And so being able to build out those transition plans really supports that, doesn't it? So we have about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to open this up for questions. I wonder, do we have a mic, or you're just going to all have to shout very loudly, I think. Oh, no, somebody's up and running. Amazing. I think that gentleman at the back had his hand up first. Should we take a few questions and then I'll give them to the panel? We might maybe hopefully collect a few that way.
Bob, you were in Imperial College. I want to submit a proposition, which is that Ellen is absolutely right. And more so, which is that government has to be the one, calling the shots here. The reason for that is I go to these conferences and it's always a guy, who says very seriously, governments can't do it all, so investors need to step up. Now, there's two problems with that statement. First is that the first phrase there is clearly nonsense. Governments could do it all if they chose to. The second is, what is it that people expect investors to step up to? There's an upper limit of how many shares of investors and how many green bonds you can actually own. So investors, of course, are looking for new opportunities, but they're not going to invest in something that doesn't generate cash flow. And that's simple investment. They've got fiduciary responsibilities. And I've been trying for a couple of years now to put together how, someone once asked me what would a natural capital bond look like, and you basically couldn't do it because the whole point of natural capital work is to preserve it, or at least manage it sensibly, as opposed to the extraction, which is what you use to pay the bonds. So where I end up here is the notion that this is really a public policy issue more than a finance issue. I mean, I think the knowledge that will be gleaned from the collective effort of this panel will be fabulous. And it's going to be, we're going to know so much more about the world after you're all done with your processes than we do now. This is going to be invaluable information. But where it really should go is not into finance, per se, but rather into public policy. Agree or disagree?
Wow, okay, good. I'm going to collect up some questions. Everyone can be collecting their thoughts. Helen, just on that one, I might come to you. Just with some of the examples that I know that you've got. I'm just giving you a bit of a heads up there. Lady here.
I think that the TCFD has exposed quite acute shortages in skills. How do you plan to anticipate that for the TNFDs? Are you going to make it into schools, college, university, professional qualifications? And do you think that will be done on a sectoral basis, or do we not have time for that?
Emily, I'm going to come to you on that one. This gentleman here, and then this lady here.
Andrew Ross from Global Garden. It's for you, actually.
I'm not sure that's allowed as the chair, but go on.
The landscape recovery scheme is begging for evaluation. We've got insurance company representatives in this audience with trillions of assets at risk. Can't you connect the two together?
Good. Sorry, would you mind just handing me?
Thank you very much. Really interesting discussion. So I'm Julie Chowdhury. I work at the UK's, got to my words now, Natural Environment Research Council. I should know where I work. So I just wanted, it's more of a comment rather than a question and a little bit of a cheeky plug, if that's okay. So completely agree with everything that all of you said, and I just wanted to kind of highlight a call to add to the mix, and I hope complimentary. So we just recently launched a call after consulting with green finance, businesses interested in green finance, and exactly what all of you were saying. So how do we harmonise data? How do you create decision-grade data so that corporates can make the decisions that they need to make? Because there is a lot of data out there. What are the magic metrics? Is 3 even enough? I have no idea. Probably not. And also the fact that there's value of biodiversity means different things in different contexts. That whole scale point that you made, Emily, absolutely, from international through to local, it's a drop in the ocean, but I just wanted to mention it because I think this call will only be as successful as it sounds as though it's trying to tackle exactly similar questions. And I just wanted to highlight it, so if anyone's interested, come and find me. And we will actually be circulating details of the initiative, so it's currently in line, but I just wanted to mention it because I think lots of people are looking at this, and I'm definitely going to follow up on the Dutch Bank work as well. So yeah, thank you.
Great.
Oh, and the final thing, my question is, thinking of Bella, Bella's point earlier about how do you bring people and just transition into the heart of it, and I didn't hear that in your discussion, so I thought I'd just ask about that.
Yeah, great question. Nicola, do you want to grab the mic?
Thank you all. Firstly, thank you for a wonderful panel, a great discussion. So my question kind of links back to Helen's point on the landscape scale investment, and is that even possible? And so I tend to think at a sort of systems level view, and the biodiversity that really worries me is more one overseas, you know, the big, systemically important ecosystems around the world. So how do you see realistically that we can tackle those bigger global challenges at that scale? And particularly, what do you see as the role of sort of sovereign financing in that? And particularly, you know, there's been recently some debt for nature swaps, for example. So you know, just a little bit of perspective on how to deal with those bigger challenges and the role of sovereigns.
I think I can, maybe, why don't we take them all, because we're running out of time, and then you're just going to have to do really rapid answers, if that's all right. There's a government there, and there's a lady there, and then that's it. We're going to hopefully, at least give an insight into some answers.
Thanks. Charlie Dixon, Vivid Economics and McKinsey. I've got a question partly for Saskia, partly for Emily. So I work with financial institutions, helping them think through the risks associated with nature loss, also nature positive alignment and growth opportunities. And one of the things I hear a lot from them is it's difficult to prioritise action on nature at the board level before they know what the regulatory timeline looks like. So when will the kind of things that the NGFS is recommending start to come into action? And so Saskia, you've touched on lots of those already. I'm maybe going to push your Christmas list that one bit further. What would make DNB comfortable actually putting some of this into action? Is it evidence? Is it others acting in cohort? It would be really interesting to hear. And then on the other side, to you, Emily, from the private sector side, what's the business case for private financial institutions to start getting involved in TNFD today and testing out the beta framework and the pilot system? Thanks.
Hope you're all getting your elevator pitches ready. Right.
Thank you. Very quick question around advancing nature finance. My name is Kate Lamb. I spoke earlier. My specialty from CDP, water and ocean are my areas of expertise. Thank you for the panel. I've sat in lots of conversations around the fact that we need more money into nature-related projects, right? And that's vital. We know that. But arguably the biggest contribution that financial institutions can make right now is aligning the hundreds of trillions of dollars, those decisions that are made every second of the day, with nature-related outcomes, with goals. So, Emily, maybe you can speak to this about the plans that the TNFD has to develop indicators and reporting frameworks for financial institutions in particular, because at the moment the frameworks are associated with corporate, and those corporates that have big water footprints or big deforestation impacts, vital. But if we miss an opportunity to require financial institutions to disclose the steps that they're taking, then we're missing an opportunity to trigger these hundreds of trillions of dollars to work in our favour.
Right, good. So we've all got lots of food for thought. Helen, I'm going to go to you first. Is there any role for finance? Is it all basically just down to us to try and solve it out?
It's down to you, Helen.
It's down to me, yeah.
No, I mean, obviously, I think at the moment we just need so much enabling policy because we haven't put a value on nature, as we know, so we're having to sort of artificially embed it now. So we're basically saying, okay, how can we get revenue streams going? We'll introduce biodiversity net gain, and now that will cause some land managers to start setting up what's called habitat banks. But that's an artificial creation, as is carbon sales. I mean, you just have to have that enabling policy to create the flow of finance. However, I would say, I do hear this a lot from the finance sector, like, oh, we're just waiting for the enabling policy. And I think, actually, we do need financial institutions to step up and put a bit of skin in the game and say, you know, these are tiny deals, and it's probably a bit of a loss for us, actually, to spend all these resources on getting some of these deals together. But it's a learning process, and it helps everyone get there faster, and I don't think we see enough of that. I mean, I just think like JP Morgan put in money into NatureVest, and it's amazing the work that NatureVest has done, and now other banks fund NatureVest as well, including Bank of America. I don't want to miss them out. I'm sure there's some others. And I'm just not seeing enough of that. We do have the Natural Capital Investment Alliance, and so that's obviously a few fund managers who have said we're all in and we'll just try and figure it out as we go along. But I do think there's just, you know, we've all got to start moving here and not just sit around saying, waiting for the perfect project to drop in my lap, because it's not going to happen. And then just on the other point on land restoration scale projects, and I agree with the woman over here who mentioned,
Kate.
Okay, thank you. About actually, it's not really going to move the needle that much. It's actually, we need a whole systems change towards nature positive. But these large restoration scale projects are entirely possible, but we don't have the first loss capital to do it. We were talking to a fund manager the other day. They needed 20 million in first loss to drive $1 billion in from private finance, and they couldn't get the 20 million first loss. And I'm just like, what a missed opportunity for $1 billion to have gone in to massive landscape scale restoration it was in Southeast Asia. So I think just why isn't that moving? Like, we need that concessionary capital. We all need to be on board with it, really, which is, you know, maybe where some of the wealth funds could play in, I suppose.
Interesting. Emily, thoughts about skills? Do we have the right skills? If not, what should we do about it? Especially about implementation of TNFD. And are our indicators actually going to help drive and align all of that capital?
Yes. So
yes.
This question on skills is a beautiful one, because my previous role was helping Professor Dasgupta with the Dasgupta Review, which had huge amounts of content, but he specifically chose to conclude on the importance of education and understanding. And he said, well, people may think that's wishy-washy, all this hard economics, where does it lead you? Well, we've got massive institutional failure, market failure and institutional failure. So all of us with citizen hats on have to understand nature, how we rely on it, the fact that all of nature, all of our activities depend on it, not the 44% or something, all of that, the potential for tipping points. We need to have this kind of ecologist brain in everything we do. So I just mentioned that in my previous role as then a segue into the more specific role with TNFD, where I think there is still a really important part of professional training to understand that, as well as all of the early years to build there, but that will take some time, at the big picture level of why the business case, as Charlie mentioned, what is the business case for interaction? It's just as much a sort of very sort of narrow materiality focus as the big picture. So what we're doing in TNFD is already thinking about capability building through pilot testing, support to the pilot testing program. And we hope that by building those materials and learnings, we'll be ready, as TCFD did, to then have a professional development support program once the framework is finalised. So that's what we've clearly got in place. And then on Kate's question about indicators, because we're moving at pace, we are building with building blocks. So we started with assessment metrics for corporates on impacts and dependencies, but you can see from the draft disclosure recommendations, they require financial institutions to report as well as corporates, as a corporate themselves and as an investor or an allocator of capital. So it's building to that point, but it's going to get more challenging because some financial institutions, as you well know, have enormous portfolios. So the questions of aggregation and comparability are going to get more acute. And to come to this kind of magic number of metrics, the task force did a landscape assessment of existing metrics, including many of CDPs, as you know, and we identified more than, it was not even comprehensive, 3,000 different metrics that are out there. That doesn't mean they're all being used. We have consolidated these into these illustrative lists, which I think, sort of about around 100. But once we get to financial institutions, we're going to need increasing consolidation to get that set, as well as having the flexibility, of course, to be able to actually get into real engagement conversations where the granular metrics are very flexible to particular circumstances in sectors and places that also apply. So in my view, it's not one metric, it's not three, and what the task force has set out is a dashboard. But what's on the dashboard and for what purpose is really important. So one of the things the task force has done is distinguish between disclosure metrics, what you'll be required to disclose against the framework, and assessment metrics, which is what you'll keep internally, but is really going to inform your decision making, and also when you're having those engagement conversations with your investors are going to be, come out in those conversations. So I think that's a really helpful distinction, and we're building anticipation towards disclosure metrics, including for financial institutions next year.
Thanks, Emily. And we also have a Green Jobs delivery group that has recently been established following the Green Jobs Task Force, which is also starting to look through these skills challenges and need, and also job needs for a net zero transition, but also to help implement the Environment Act. So there's definitely stuff happening on the skills side. Saskia, really quickly, just the point, I guess, on sequencing. What comes first? Regulation, reporting? Do you need the regulation before the reporting happens? Any quick thoughts you've got on that? And then, Karen, any thoughts about the just transition, which we haven't really, you're right, brought out the sort of social element of that, and that really is, underpins all of this, right? I'm going to come to you for that.
The short answer would be, from my side, for example, the Dutch Central Bank is already acting. So, of course, most of our work focuses on the analytics, getting the quantification of these risks right, assessing where they are. But for example, in supervision, next to climate-related risks, environmental risks are already part of our supervisory framework. And that's the same actually for the entire SSM, so European-wide. Supervisors will have to take this on board in assessing the risks at the institutions they supervise. At the Dutch Central Bank, for example, we're already also starting to explore what we can do in our own reserve management as regards biodiversity. And for example, we have a sustainability platform which we use to engage in conversations with the financial institutions at board level, but then in the Dutch context, where biodiversity is one of the main pillars. I would say in those conversations, the ball is already rolling. I don't know what the timeline will be. It will take some time maybe when there's tough regulation, but the minds are being made up now. So if I were an institution, I would rather join the conversation and start thinking about this myself than wait and see until the regulation comes. For example, the European Commission already has this in all its work plans. So I think a lot will be happening in the coming year.
At least if you're at the table, you can start shaping things, can't you? Just transition, Karen.
Okay, I'm going to weave together a response to several questions
and that
end at just transition, so hopefully it will deliver on that. Okay, so I totally agree that public policy is absolutely critical. This is basically a massive market failure, and unless government tackles it, we won't get there. The market will not fix it by itself. The challenge, of course, is the political economy. So basically it means we're putting a price on something we all took for free before, and no one wants that. No one wants to pay for something that was free before. So how do you actually make it attractive to do that? And I do have a hope that by requiring the financial sector to, and the wider corporate sector to have net zero, nature positive transition plans, they will then start realising, actually, we can't deliver on this until government does the right things in terms of making this profitable. And then they will lobby government consistently to do the right things and become net zero, nature positive economic policy, which turns on its head previous possible lobbying activities of the private sector. So potentially quite a powerful theory of change. I hope it works out that way. The other thing I think I want to link to is incentivising at a macro level, and someone talked about sovereign financing, and I think that is absolutely critical as well. We're seeing a growth in sustainability-linked bonds at the corporate and now sovereign level beginning to happen as well, which has the potential to actually create global macroeconomic incentives for improved environmental governance by country governments, because it will mean they get lower cost of capital on their sovereign borrowing. So that's the kind of policy framework we need and private sector financing framework we need that would actually make it, sensible to put a price on nature and to start protecting nature, because otherwise the incentives are just not there to do that. So I think that is really important. blended finance mechanisms can also really help with that. And you know, so where you need to have some degree of subsidy in that private sovereign market to actually make it more, strengthen those incentives even more for investment in nature. I think there's lots of potential to do that, and there's a growing sort of body of work around that. And basically, to come to the just transition piece, what this means ultimately is that probably, to generalise massively, it means more finance going from the rich north who've destroyed all of their natural capital to the, you know, relatively less well-off south who still have a lot of natural capital. So it's a massive transfer of resources we're probably going to see if we ever achieve this nature-positive global economy from the north to the south. That makes it politically difficult to actually negotiate, but nonetheless is what should probably happen if we want to incentivise protection and sort of sustainable management of those natural assets in the global south. So I hope I managed to answer all those questions.
That was amazing. So we've gone over. Apologies, and thank you all for staying till the end. Thank you very much to my panel. You've been amazing. Thank you to all of you for all of your questions. I think we just about managed to cover everything off. There was a few that slipped through. That is always the way of things. But thank you very much. Let's move from the why, the what, and onto the how. Thank you.